Welcome to the Fantasy Football Factory podcast. I am, one of your hosts, Barstool Mintzy, joined as always by Steven Cheah. Getting ready for the season, man. We're down to, I guess, we're
couple weeks away.
About 3 weeks, a little under 3 weeks left. And, so far we've done podcasts. We've done quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends. Well, now we're going to fill out your fantasy roster. And today we're going to talk about defenses. And we also have the lead fantasy analyst from The Score that I know you're excited about.
Yeah, Justin Boone makes an appearance. We interviewed him for probably about 30, 40 minutes, talking everything he foresees this fantasy season. Disagreed on a few things, but he gave some great insight, and it's hard to poke holes in his logic.
Well, I know the big disagreement on Christian McCaffrey coming. I can promise you that. Yeah. We're going to go ahead before we get into the preview and our defensive rankings and some strategies for drafting defense. I'm going to have a personal moment of silence for Matt Corral, who my Ole Miss hero at quarterback, who has a Liz Frank foot injury and is going to miss his entire rookie year of the 2022 season. I'm crushed, Steven.
Tough. Shefty just
it takes first person to ever take Ole Miss to a 10-win regular season, dude. Those things don't happen. Dude was a warrior on the field. Follows me on Twitter. I got to know him pretty good last year. Free fell on the draft, had a brutal pre-draft situation, ends up late third round in Carolina. And then behind a fourth-string offensive line, Matt Rule throws him out there. And now he's got a Liz Frank injury that's going to cost him his rookie year, man. There are a lot of things in life you could say are fair, but football, not one of them.
Totally. All right, let's get into
let's move on.
Special teams units. This is an interesting one because scoring systems vary. Like a lot of commissioners, I've seen like a safety worth like 10 points. Like there are kind of weird scoring systems that you can alter. Interceptions, fumbles, safeties, etc. can all be worth different things. But for the most part, this is I don't want to call it a luxury, but like a bottom of the totem pole position on your fantasy roster. And a lot of leagues have moved to eliminating a kicker. I would say probably about 2/3 of leagues still have kickers, but it is becoming more and more the trend to eliminate that position altogether. But defense, special teams, I don't foresee that position really ever getting eliminated. And there's a lot of different value in where, in defenses that take the ball away and score. We saw, in most of my leagues last year, the Dallas Cowboys were the number one unit. Trayvon Diggs got a lot of heat for giving up the most yards in coverage, but he also, had double-digit picks, had a couple touchdowns. Micah Parsons, really exciting rookie, did a lot of things off the edge. So they're a tough unit to evaluate. But Mintzy, going into drafts, what would be your best advice for drafting a defense special teams unit? Would it be, kind of middle rounds, or are you kind of an absolute wait till the end guy?
Man, I'm a pretty big wait till the end guy. Because I feel like there's a fallacy where a lot of people, when they're drafting, just want to draft their whole starting roster. And so a lot of times they'll just get all their I got my quarterback and I got my running back and I got my receivers, my tight end. I'm going to go ahead and draft my defense 7th or 8th round. And let me sneak in here and get the Bills or the Steelers or whoever you think is number one. And to me, when you look at the wide receiver position, which we just previewed, 40, 45 guys I liked. I mean, you're talking – the number one receiver for Green Bay, Allen Lazard, for example, or Juju Smith-Schuster and KC possibly. Those are the kind of guys you can draft over a first defense. And so I think that I would wait on defense. And as far as defenses go too, it's interesting because you mentioned I'm looking for defenses to make plays and wreak havoc, whether it be sacks, turnovers, whatever. Like I'm not worried necessarily about the boring old points per game stat or who stops the run well. I'm looking for defenses with playmakers that are causing havoc and making plays, because that's where the fantasy value is. It's turnovers, it's interceptions, it's sacks. It's not allowing 10.8 points per game in a boring way. So those are kind of some of the stuff I'm looking to. And then one other strategy I want to mention, I also like to look at defenses that play in crappy division. More against crappy quarterbacks a lot. Mm-hmm. And so, you just mentioned the Cowboys. Well, what was a big part of the Cowboys being number one in fantasy last year? Whoever was out there for the Giants football team and Eagles last year in 6 division games. I think that's an important factor as well.
Absolutely. And I agree with you as far as draft strategy. wait till the absolute end. There isn't, there have been years past where there's been iconic defenses that are going to be good and create a lot of turnovers. The Ravens, the Steelers, the Legion of Boom Seahawks, the Bears back in their heyday, the Bucs, the Ravens, etc. So those I could see maybe doing, still double digit round, but, round 12, 13, making a move. I would not touch a defense until, really the last 2 rounds, I think. If you really, really love a defense and then, they're your favorite team and you have, inside beat, you think these, couple of guys are going to break out this year. All right, maybe 3 rounds from the end, but I really don't even like that. Especially this year where there's so much variability. Like in ranking these defenses, we rank the top 10. I don't see a huge difference from number 1 and number 10. Like it's kind of,
I don't either. I think it's very subjective. And also during the year too, you can, you talked about this with streaming tight ends. You can stream defenses like crazy too. Or if you look a week or 2 ahead at who's got the good matchups and stuff, that's another way you can kind of combat this. So
this is actually a tactic I want to touch on that has worked really well for me in the past, is that if you can kind of solidify your roster and have, one solid, like money, reliable backup at running back, at receiver, at quarterback, usually. If you can have one of those guys that is rock solid, you can kind of load up on defenses. And that really helps, because if you look a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks in advance, you can save your waiver budget to be used on, more important positions like backup running backs and, receivers, et cetera. Whereas defenses, if you're just forward looking and not just looking at the next week when everyone's going to bid up, the defense who's playing the crappiest team, you can really take advantage of that. So I've been a guy who towards playoff time could hoard 4 defenses. It could be my starters and 3 backups, and I'm looking at each individual week of the postseason. And that could be how I roll. And I have done that before with success.
And also on the waiver wire thing, I like what you're saying here, because when you're playing the 0 running back strategy that you and I both like, but you really have gotten behind for years, you need to save your big fantasy waiver wire money for running backs. Because that's a big part of the 0 running back strategy, is running backs invariably get hurt all the freaking time. And so you need that money to throw down a few hundred to outbid people that are handcuffing and worried about all that. So I think that's the point.
Absolutely. But there's not really that much more to say about defense, special teams. We're not going to spend the entire episode going through that, but let's go through the rankings. We each did a top 10. So Mintzy, why don't you go through your top 10 first, and then I'll go after you.
You want me to start from 10 or 1?
Go 1 to 10.
Okay. Number 1, I got the Buffalo Bills. I won't synopsis every single one of them, but the reason I got them number 1 is they just make a crap ton of plays. I like them adding Von Miller as a pass rusher. Trey White got hurt late last year, tore his ACL. Getting him back is very, very big. They missed him a ton in that Chiefs game. I can tell you that. All right, 2 through 10, I won't make comments on them. Saints, Bucks, 49ers, Rams, Ravens, Cowboys, Steelers, Patriots, Green Bay Packers.
Yeah, I like the Ravens. They're getting a lot of their playmakers back. Marcus Peters is a huge guy for fantasy just because he is a guy who takes chances and, is willing to go for that pick and, return the other way. Marlon Humphrey is going to be back. They have a lot of new additions, Marcus Williams. So they are a team that I like in fantasy. I have them ranked 10. I'll go through my top 10. I like the Dallas Cowboys again, number 1. They were, number 1 in most of my leagues last year. Micah Parsons, just a lights out defensive player, can do so many things. And then Trayvon Diggs is a guy similar to Marcus Peters that gets burned a lot, but he is willing to take those chances, and he does make a lot of plays. So I like the Dallas Cowboys number 1. I got the Bucks number 2, Miami Dolphins number 3. They were the number 4 defense last year in most of my leagues. I just think they have a lot of playmakers. I think they're going to play a little bit more grinded out football. So I like the Miami Dolphins. I have the Buffalo Bills 4th. I'm with you in lockstep with the Rams 5th overall. San Francisco 49ers headed up by Nick Bosa. I have 6. 7, I have the Philadelphia Eagles, a big play Slay. The New England Patriots, who are almost always a top 10 defense, I have at number 8. Green Bay Packers, I'm in agreement with you. I have them 9. You have them 10. They're getting a lot of guys back. Jair Alexander being probably the most critical. Rashawn Gary had a big breakout year last year. And then 10. I have the Baltimore Ravens. We have a pretty good amount of overlap in that top 10. But again, I have the Cowboys number 1. Mintzy has them 7. He has the Bills 1. I have them 4. I think there's not that much to separate these. So again, drafting this year, 2022, there isn't a defense that's, a cut above that is going to hold teams to 14 points and score, 6 touchdowns.
Well, I think one thing that's interesting is I really like the playmaking ability of the Chargers defense, especially adding Khalil Mack. But you notice we didn't mention one AFC West
division.
All the quarterbacks are so good. The games are so high scoring. And so, neither one of us had any of those 4, and Denver could have a really good D too. But the games are all going to be shootouts, we think. So we're staying away. So I think that's kind of coming back to my point about the quarterback play.
Yeah, exactly. And then one more thing on defense. Let's just get into futures. We've been pumping the Barstool Sportsbook a bit. I know there was a player or two that you liked. Right now you can bet on things like Defensive Player of the Year, Defensive Rookie of the Year, but they also have a full other section in the NFL futures with just defensive props. Are there any defensive plays that you like this season? I can go ahead and mention a couple that I've already bet. I like Micah Parsons, Defensive Player of the Year. I just think he is, always an interesting guy. He has so much potential. I thought he should have won it last year, to be honest, just the way that he finished. That is at plus 1,100 right now, which I really like. Also, I believe I bet a couple long shots in that. I liked Max Crosby. I know that, going to play in a division that's going to be a lot higher scoring, but I just like him so much as a player. He's plus 33 to 1 and plus 3,300.
He also has Chandler Jones now on the opposite side to take the heat off him.
Yep. And then I bet this every year. I bet Devin White Defensive Player of the Year. He just has that potential. He's 60 to 1, a couple bucks on that. But those are the main defensive awards that I like as far as futures. I did bet a guy you like a lot, Derek Stingley. I know you were kind of all over him and talking him up. His over under is 1.5 interceptions. He has such great ball skills that I just really like him to get. He could get this week 1 realistically. Not that he will. 2 interceptions will be a lot for a guy in his debut, but it wouldn't be crazy to see him to get 2 in a game. So I like that. It's at minus 125 right now in the Barstool Sportsbook.
Well, okay, good. It was taking a little bit to load on mine. I took Derek Stingley on a just flyer. I mean, he's 100 to 1 to lead the NFL in interceptions. Yeah, he's getting $5 to win 500 on that. I mean, it's not a big bet, but when it's a lotto ticket like that. I think that, I could see I don't know if, leading it's tough, but I could see a world where he gets like 7 or 8, it's, you're hopefully not a year where somebody goes off like Diggs did last year and gets double, you don't see that every year though. Yeah. At that situation, but no, I like a lot of your picks. The Devin White thing, he's a monster, and he's also a personal favorite of mine because my first year at sports radio, he was still a senior in high school, and we were covering him in North Louisiana. So I've been pulling for him and following him for a long time. So he's probably the only Tampa Bay Buck I can stand to be flat out transparent.
One more I will mention, Justin Simmons, over 3.5 interceptions is plus money. It's at plus 101 right now. He's done it the last 3 years with a better defense and, expects to be higher scoring games. I don't see why, he wouldn't exceed 4+. So, that is another one I like, but those are the defensive, props that I liked for this season. Anyone get into our guest, Mintzy?
What's up? Yeah, let's do it. So we're going to be joined now by the Score's leading fantasy analyst, big Twitter following, a guy that's really built up a big following in fantasy football. His name is Justin Boone, and now we get to sit down with him, and he, like many, has some disagreements with your rankings, Mr. Cheah.
Yeah, I will caveat one thing for those watching on YouTube. There was some slight difficulties as far as downloading the views that we want. So it is going to be mainly the view of Justin himself. We are obviously talking and nodding in agreement in the background or disagreeing, but not all of that is captured. So just a heads up if you're watching on YouTube, apologies for that.
Welcome to the Fantasy Football Factory podcast. I am Barstool Mintzy, joined as always by Steven Cheah. We've been having a good time. We've been running through previews of each position, but today we're going a little different angle. We got a special guest today, Steven.
Yeah, Justin Boone from The Score, Fantasy Football Podcast with Justin Boone. How are we doing today?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic. I mean, what a great time to jump on here and talk. We had the first game last night. It's not much of a game. It doesn't tell us too much, but at least we got to see some NFL players on a field. And I think that's when some of the casual fans start getting a little more excited, right? Everybody starts coming back around. We see all the numbers for all the fantasy content really start to spike at this time. And we're a couple weeks away from like the main fantasy draft season really kicking off. So it's a very exciting time.
What do you think about the people that do their drafts like in early or mid-August?
I mean, I think they're probably crazy like I am. I think that a lot of the people, throughout the off season that are following all my content, it's awesome. I can't believe the numbers that we pull throughout, the spring and the summer, when you would think a lot of people would kind of shy away from fantasy. There's not as much going on, but I mean, I'm drafting all year long. I've been doing that for a long time now. So I love the people that are doing that as well. Like I said, I think they're the hardcores, and, it's a different conversation. Sometimes you got to remember, I have friends who check out for the entire off season. And then this time of year is when they jump back in. You got to remember those people are coming back in too. We got to get them caught up as well. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did see, we're taping this in full transparency. What is it? August 5th, August 6th. It's the first preseason game was last night. And yesterday, you're tweeting out your rankings. So you got half point PPR, standard PPR, dynasty, salary cap value, et cetera. We typically go off half point PPR just because that's kind of the most in the middle with what people have. And I was looking over your stuff. And one thing immediately caught my eye at the very top. You Jonathan Taylor ranked number 2, which is a universal number 1 guy. You have Christian McCaffrey number 1, a guy who's played 10 games the past 2 years. I would love to hear why you have C-Mac number 1.
I mean, I'd love to hear the opposite argument at this point. Like, I think there was some concerns with the quarterback situation, and I don't think Baker's going to come in and be some superstar for them, but I think he can come in and give them better quarterback play than they've had recently when you look at some of the names that have been under center for them. So I think that's a good thing for the offense. But also with that first overall pick, I want to take the guy that has the highest possible ceiling. And when you look at CMC and what he's been able to do in the past, you're talking about PPR leagues being able to put up over 30 fantasy points per game for a season. Like, we've seen him do that before, right? In half PPR, 27 fantasy points per game, right? When you're looking at guys like Derrick Henry last year, I think he was around 23 in half PPR. Jonathan Taylor in the 20s, but nowhere near what CMC can do based on the receiving production. And he's kind of bulletproof in the sense that even if they go down, even if the Panthers aren't good this year, you could have a game where he's getting, 10 catches and still having 100 yards through the air. So he's got multiple ways to get it done. And I think the main argument against him is just the health. And maybe he is breaking down at this point. They brought in some other guys like Deonta Foreman. Maybe they'll take a little bit away from him. But on Jonathan Taylor's side, all we're hearing out of Colts camp is that Nyheim Hines is going to have more of a role. And when you have a quarterback in there like Matt Ryan, I think he'd be more willing to check down to a guy like Nyheim Hines versus Carson Wentz, who really doesn't do that as much, who they had last year. So I think it's not that I'm concerned about Taylor. When you talk about a lot of these guys near the top, they're all going to be good picks barring injury, probably. Like, most of these guys aren't going to fail on talent. It's just going to be at the end of the season, we're going to look back and we're going to go, well, that guy missed 6 games and that guy missed the season with an ACL and that sort of stuff. So I tend to spend more time a little further down the draft board trying to dig into that stuff, because I think everybody, how many times have you guys seen after the first 3 rounds of a draft, everybody has a super team? Oh, I love my team. I got 3 great players. Everybody's got a great team after 3 rounds, right? So I don't really nitpick too much near the top, but when you're talking about those guys, I just think CMC has the much higher ceiling.
What are your thoughts on, so a claim to fame I claim to have is in 2009, I invented the 0 RB strategy, which is a little bit before it was publicized. But how do you feel about those strategies? Obviously, your top 200 is pretty running back heavy at the top. How many running backs this year in a 12-team league, half point PPR, do you feel comfortable taking with a first round pick?
Well, like you said, I don't tend to go running back that early often. I tend to go more of, if you want to call it hero RB, I'll grab one guy in the first couple of rounds. Depends where I'm picking, of course, and in snake drafts, that kind of dictates what you do a lot of the time. But up at the top, I think there's a good handful of guys that I'm willing to take. There's probably 6 or so guys that I'd be willing to take in the first round that I would feel good about. There's other guys that are going in that range. Derrick Henry, I have some concerns, with the injury status with him, just based on the type of back he is too. 28 coming off a foot injury. Those foot injuries can be worrisome. So, can he get back? He'll probably have another great season. I mean, Derrick Henry, I feel like he's proved me wrong so many times where you think it's not going to happen for him. You think he's going to break down. And then the next thing you know, he's out there running for 200 yards and 4 touchdowns at the end of the season, right? So he's a guy that I don't tend to have a lot of shares of this season just because I'm a little more worried about the type of back he is and the potential for him breaking down at his age. There's guys, though, that I think aren't even getting a lot of respect up at the top, like somebody like DeAndre Swift, who last year was a top 10 fantasy back in points per game. When you're talking about the first 10 games before he got hurt, he came back at the end of the season. There was a couple of games near the end of the year where they weren't really in the playoff mix. They didn't load him up with touches. So I kind of chopped those off. I look at those first 10 games, what he was doing. And you're talking about a guy that in PPR, RB7 in fantasy points per game over that stretch, and half PPR, like you guys keep talking about, RB9. And I think there's a potential for a lot more. I think that offense could be a lot better this year. I think they have one of the best offensive lines in the league that a lot of people probably don't realize because it's the Lions and everybody kind of looks at that Lions offense like they're not great, but start to look at some of those pieces they're putting together. And Jared Goff, maybe a little concerning, but we've seen him before. When he has the weapons around him, he can keep an offense moving. He can keep a lot of fantasy players alive in an offense. So I think Swift's going to have a great year. And any concerns about Jamal Williams, you look at last year, there was 4 games or so where they both were healthy and they were both on the field together. And Swift got by far way more touches than Williams. Williams was kind of getting phased out there. So I'm not really worried about a split there. And in those first 10 games, you had Swift averaging 5.3 passes per game over a full season. That's a 90 catch pace if he can keep that up, right? So I think there's a lot of potential for him. But like I said, there's a bunch of guys in that first round that could come through, barring any sort of injury. The Ecklers, I don't really love Najee Harris. I think he's more of a volume play versus talent. I'd rather go with the talent. But Joe Mixon, somebody who I think is getting kind of underrated. Everybody on that team, everybody wants to focus on the Bengals passing attack. Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and we talk about the receivers. I'm sure we'll talk about both those guys, but they tend to be kind of the more attractive options, the sexier choices, where Joe Mixon's coming off a career year. And I know the touchdowns were really high, 16 scores last year, might see some regression in that area, but also they've gone out and addressed really the biggest problem on their team, that offensive line. They bring in Alex Kappa and Lau Collins and Ted Karras, kind of rebuild that whole one side of the line. And yeah, everybody wants to say it's going to be great for Joe Burrow and maybe he won't get sacked as much. It'd be great for the running game as well and for Joe Mixon.
I've got a question. So I'm looking at your quarterback rankings, and I had him 9. You've got Jalen Hurts at 6. I assume, is this like a 4-point passing touchdown league? Because it seems like I understand having the quarterbacks that run is kind of a cheat code in fantasy football, especially if you've got 25 yards per point passing and 4-point passing touchdowns. But I see Trey Lance number 9, Jalen Hurts number 6. So you're all about the running value quarterback, it looks like.
Yeah, I would have Hurts up there regardless. I don't tweak the rankings too much 4 to 6 point. Like I'm looking for upside when I'm looking at these quarterbacks, and I want guys who, like this year I've talked about. We just did on our show, the Score Fantasy Football Podcast. We just did the quarterback preview episode actually earlier this week, and I talked about kind of my approach this year. And one of the big things for me is I want that upside, right? So I think I really want one of the top 12 guys this year, which is normally easy because if you're in a 12-team league, you're going to be able to get the 12th guy before someone grabs a backup, hopefully, if you don't wait too long. But I think those 12 guys all have the potential to crack the top 5 or so. But a guy like Jalen Hurts, what we saw from him last year, I mean, he puts up top 7 quarterback numbers on a point per game basis. And then I really like what they're doing around him. And you see some teams like the Bears and Justin Fields. I mean, it's going to be tough for him this season. They didn't go out and get him much to work with. And maybe that's because the new regime wants to move on next year. Maybe they're kind of sewering him purposely because they're going to go draft their own guy next season. We'll see. But that's the wrong way to approach it. You want to surround your young quarterback with as much talent as possible. And we've seen, the Bills did that with Josh Allen. We're seeing some teams this year, like, Zach Wilson and the Jets, they go out, they're spending up big to get another quality receiver and a good running back there and trying to improve the line. The Dolphins are doing it with Tua. You go out and get a Tyreek Hill. You go out and get a Teron Armstead, a stud left tackle, and try to improve that offensive line. So that's the way to do it. And when you look at Hurts, what did they do? They did the exact same. You already have one of the best offensive lines in the league there. You have a guy like Davonte Smith, who, when he came out, I kind of projected him. I thought that he kind of profiled more as like a really good number 2 receiver in the pros. I didn't think he was going to emerge as that number 1. It was possible, but I thought he was going to do a better job if he could find a solid number 2 role. And now they bring in that alpha guy in AJ Brown to take over and kind of bump everybody down one peg. And now you have a Dallas Goddard who talent-wise, if Dallas Goddard got the kind of volume that some of the elite tight ends got, he could put up those kind of stats.
Yep.
He's not going to see that kind of volume, so you're not going to get the elite numbers out of him, but still a pretty solid tight end one for fantasy. But you have this situation now for Hurts where you have this really good receiving core that can help improve his all-around play, like we've seen with other quarterbacks in that situation where they bring in all the talent around them. And you have the rushing stats there that, maybe he'll regress a little bit. He had a lot of rushing touchdowns last year. That's hard to repeat, but I think he has potential to be top 5, maybe even higher this year. Like he can be right up there along the Lamar Jacksons and the Josh Allens if everything goes right. And I get there's still some questions about the accuracy and stuff, but I think potential wise, he's right up there where, I have a few more questions about some of the other guys that I have him ahead of.
I got a quick following up on that. We've been debating AJ Brown a lot, and he was obviously the number one guy in Tennessee with Tannehill. He's going to be the number one receiver. The Eagles paid him. How do you think that affects his value? Do you think he can keep up the same? Obviously, he's dealt with some injuries, but do you think if healthy, he keeps that? Does he step back a little bit, or does he stay around the same?
No, I think he'll step back. I think that the passing volume, I think that the Eagles are going to want to pass as much as possible, but I think we saw last year that when Jalen Hurts tried to really run that heavy passing attack, that's not really what works for them, right? They need to kind of blend, his rushing style along with their passing attack and kind of find a good middle ground there. What they did last year was like one end to the other end. They went pass heavy and it didn't really work. And then they went run heavy and it worked great. I think now with the weapons they have, they'll be able to kind of find that middle ground. But in this offense, I don't expect them to be among the league leaders in passing attempts. So yeah, that's definitely going to hurt AJ Brown when you have those other guys there that I mentioned who are pretty good options and better competition than he had in Tennessee for targets, right? So it bumps him down a little bit. He'll still be around, that fringe low end tight end one kind of range, maybe, or wide receiver one kind of range, maybe, high end wide receiver 2, but that's a lot further down than we had him in previous years where he was up, on the top 6, top 7, potentially. When you look at the talent that he has and what he could do. Yeah.
I want to get to your overvalued and undervalued guys, but one more ranking question I have for you going through the quarterbacks that stuck out to me. Tom Brady, QB 10. Guy who's thrown for 40 plus touchdowns each of the last 2 years, arguably the best wide receiving core in football. Why do you hate the GOAT?
I don't hate the GOAT. It's funny you say that, though, because almost anytime I put my rankings out, I think there's some people that don't realize like fantasy rankings are different than real life rankings. Because every time I put my rankings out,
QB3 last year,
there's someone who will comment and go, "Why is Tom Brady not number 1 on this list?" And it's like, but I'm looking at it. I know Chris Godwin was back out at practice today with the knee brace. I know things are looking a little more positive, but almost every injury analyst out there says that they would be foolish to put him out there week 1 in a full capacity. So I still have a lot of doubts that Godwin's going to be. What's that?
He'll be on a pitch count for sure.
Yeah. If he's out there, they definitely got to go because they want to win the Super Bowl, right? They don't need to win week 1. And they brought in all these other guys and they might just be, fillers like Julio Jones. I don't think they're getting Julio Jones from 5 years ago. I think they're getting a version of Julio Jones that maybe could be more of what Rob Gronkowski was at an offense, right? Be that big body guy. And maybe be the weapon around the red zone as that big body guy, even though Julio, not really a huge red zone threat with the Falcons, but, with Brady, maybe he'll be able to get that done. So they've done a good job of bringing in, Russell Gage to kind of fill the Antonio Brown role and try to figure this stuff out. Even, the ghost of Kyle Rudolph there. I don't think he's going to be what Kyle Rudolph was in the past with the Vikings, but a guy who can catch some touchdowns and do something for you. So I think that's great, but really, and you kind of mentioned it earlier, really, this is my bias for the rushing quarterbacks coming in, right? I just see with Brady, if the weapons don't hit without Godwin, at full speed at the beginning of the season, if everything doesn't come together and you really just have to lean on Mike Evans and you don't get as much from the other guys, that's where I'm worried. They're going to throw a ton still. Brady's still going to try to get it done in that respect. But without that rushing, potential, it just lowers his floor for me. Even if, when everything goes right and everything's clicking, he can be up in the top 5 for sure. And like I mentioned, he's one of those top 12 that I think has the potential to be up there. Yep. But I just have a lot more excitement about some of these other guys, Russell Wilson and Trey Lance, these guys that have potentially big rushing upside and have the weapons to get up there.
Yeah.
Can I follow up on the Trey Lance thing real quick?
Sure, yeah.
All right. You got Trey Lance number 9. Everyone knows the upside. Got the huge arm. He can also run. We've been debating a lot, George Kittle and Debo and how Trey Lance affects all those guys because, in theory, they're going to try to run the ball and set up play action down the field. And I don't think you don't think he'll throw 30 or 35 times a game. What are your thoughts on Trey Lance and his impact on those guys?
I think there's a chance, like going from Jimmy Garoppolo to Trey Lance. I think there's a chance once Lance is comfortable that he actually does raise that passing attack, like the efficiency of it, takes more shots downfield. Like, I think that's something everyone wants to look at it and go, he's going to be more of like a Jalen Hurts, and, he's not going to be able to put up huge passing stats. It's going to all be rushing. And at the beginning, it's probably going to be a bit of that. But with those guys that they have in San Francisco, these like yak monsters, all of them, Kittle's like that, Debo's like that, even Brandon Ayuk, all these guys can get it done, get them a short pass, let them do the work and put up some big stats on top of the fact that they can beat you downfield as well. So I think they're going to be good. I think Kittle is someone that I've looked at though, and I would lump him kind of with Darren Waller here, where their situations have changed, right? Like things are different for them now. And they used to be in that elite conversation with Kelsey, and talent wise, especially receiving, like Waller, maybe not the best all round tight end, but receiving wise, talent wise, they're still in that conversation. But what they're going to do fantasy wise this season, I don't think they're going to be up there. I bumped them down a little bit, and they're still, 4th and 5th in my rankings, but I don't have them in that elite conversation anymore. I have them behind a guy like Kyle Pitts now, just because you look at the situation changing for Kittle, like you mentioned, right? Like things are going to change a little bit in that passing attack. And now Kittle for years was kind of the de facto number one in that passing attack. Now you have Debo really emerging after last year. You have Ayuk. I mean, somebody who I've talked about his talent for a while now, but you're seeing it. He's not in the doghouse to start this year. Hopefully that doesn't change over the next month or so. But last year after that, he came out of it in the last 10 games, was the wide receiver 22 in fantasy points per game, right? And the year before, when everybody was injured, Ayuk was wide receiver 15 from like week 3 on or something like that. So he could put up really high end stats as well. So I think that's going to hurt Kittle because now he's not that de facto number one volume wise. He'll still have some monster games, but it's not going to be the same for him. And Waller's the exact same situation. Waller kind of before was that number one receiver, even though he was a tight end. And now you bring in Davonte Adams and good luck. He's still going to be okay. He's still going to have some good games. But to get into that elite conversation where Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews, we saw last year, he finishes the tight end one, or Kyle Pitts could potentially join them if he can get some touchdowns this year. I just don't think they belong in that conversation this season.
Absolutely. I know we got you for a couple more minutes. Let's talk about a couple guys you think are overvalued and you'd rather not touch, and some guys that you're really buying shares of that are undervalued.
Man, I mean, what do you want to do? Let's do the positive first. Let's do the undervalued first, right? You look at quarterback. We talked about Tua. I don't think I have to go over that again. We talked about Jameis. I don't think we have to go over that again. James Conner at running back is somebody that he sneaks into the second round sometimes, but you look at like what he was doing last season, and I know a lot of it was touchdown based early in the year, but he was absolutely killing it. Was a top 12 fantasy back in points per game over the course of the season before he got hurt. End of the season, I know he got hurt. And I think he's another one. You look at CMC and say it's the injuries and the durability concerns. James Conner, that's the reason why people don't want to buy in, right? It's the age, he's 27, but it's also everyone has it in their mind that he is just so fragile and that he's going to break. But the reality here is that he's missed 14 games over the last 4 seasons or so, but he's missing on average 2 to 3 games a year. And in those seasons, like that's what a running back misses often, right? Like that's not that shocking these days for running back to not be out there. And if you're telling me that the rest of the time he's going to be able to give me top 12 numbers, maybe even better, when Chase Edmonds was out last year, Conner was the RB2 in fantasy points per game. He was averaging like 25 fantasy points per game, second only to Jonathan Taylor during that stretch. That was week 9 to week 14. So if I can get that, and I'm not saying it's going to be that's outrageous to project that he's going to do that again, but that shows you what the ceiling could be for him. So I think he deserves to be in the conversation as a running back one this year. And you can get him at the end of the second round. You can get him in the third round quite often. I think he's a great pick. I think Chase Edmonds is really interesting too. And you talk about getting a lead back in what I think is going to be a much better offense now that he's in Miami, and getting that guy really deep into the draft. You're getting him like pretty far into the draft. You can set up every other position basically on your lineup. And then you grab Chase Edmonds and hope for the upside. You look at the contract that he got from Miami, 2 years, $12 million versus Raheem Mostert, who still banged up. We'll see if he's ready for week 1, but Mostert, 1-year contract around $2 million. Sony Michel, 1-year contract around $2 million. So that tells me they really like Edmonds the best. And also he's the only one of those guys that really has done anything receiving wise in the pros. So that also gives him a bump as well. And talked about the upgrades in the offensive line and everything there. And then another running back too, that I don't think is getting enough attention, at least as like an early season guy, is Cordell Patterson. And I'm not saying grab him as your
saying that too.
Yeah, I'm not saying grab him as your RB1, but like in Scott Fishbowl, for example, I did the hero RB approach. I got a running back early, filled out everywhere else. And then I was looking, okay, who am I going to get? And I was hoping to get Edmonds. I didn't. Somebody sniped him. But then I grabbed Cordell Patterson because last year, fantastic stats. I know that he broke down as the year went along. I get it. And he's 31 years old. And this is the weirdest situation for us to buy into. But when you look at what he did, that he can put up top, 15, top 20 stats for you when he's on the field, and it's touchdown based, it's receiving based. But I still think he can get it done this year, even with the Tyler Algier, who is more of an early down grinder kind of guy. I don't think he profiles as like a guy who's going to take over that backfield. So I really like Patterson. And I think the way they're treating him this offseason, where they rested him in OTAs, that tells me he wasn't hurt. They were just resting him. They don't want to get him hurt. They want to make sure that he's ready to go for the season, that he can be that weapon for them. So I really like him. Receiver, there's a ton of guys. I mean, I won't spend too much time on it. Brandon Cooks, Darno Mooney. Darno Mooney is an interesting one. I should probably tweet this out. I never think to tweet out the stats I come across, but last year, 8 of the top 10 receivers and targets per game average, 8 of the top 10 finished as top 12 fantasy wide receivers. And that's obvious. You get the volume, you put up the stats, right? Like that. And guys command targets when they're a really good player. But Mooney last year was 18th in targets per game. Now you have Allen Robinson out of the mix. I think he's going to spike up there even more. I think he could be in that top 10 potentially target wise. And now I think he could potentially be a wide receiver 1. I think that's the upside for him. Adam Thielen, for the last 5 years, I know he's missed time 2 of the last 3 seasons. Before the last 5 years, when he's been out there and not injured, he's been averaging wide receiver 1 numbers. And that was shocking to me because beginning of the offseason, I was ready to kind of be out on Adam Thielen, even though in years past, I really liked him. And the more I looked at it, I thought, even if I get 8 games out of Adam Thielen, if I'm getting 8 games where he's going to give me top 12, top 15 kind of stats, I'm more than happy to take that. So he's another guy. I mean, Ayuk's another guy. Cole Kmet along the same lines of the Darno Mooney thing. I think he's somebody that could put up much bigger numbers than kind of where he's going in drafts. Somebody that last year people probably don't realize, but 60 catches, over 600 yards, just no touchdowns. That's why his fantasy numbers weren't as big this year. If he gets the volume, hopefully finds the end zone a few times with Jimmy Graham gone now. I think he could be somebody that could sneak into that, mid tight end 1 kind of range, and you can get him well outside the top 10, top 12 at the position. So that's a bunch of them. And then, oh man, I hate going with the negative stuff, but
I want to touch on the Adam Thielen thing really quick because
go for it.
I've had this theory, and they're obviously coaching regime change. Kevin O'Connell coming in, installing that McVay type system, and I am not making this comparison because I think he is going to be this. But if you look at the Vikings offense, everyone anticipates Justin Jefferson, who's already, a fantasy god at the receiver position, seeing a big spike in production with O'Connell in this new offense. Adam Thielen is a guy physically and kind of what he does on the field profiles similarly to Cooper Kupp as far as long speed. He is much older, but is kind of that red zone target, has that wiggle. Cooper Kupp ran a 4.62. Thielen was much faster than that when he came out. Obviously an older player, but what do you think about Thielen seeing a big Boone kind of with Kevin O'Connell as the head coach?
Yeah, I definitely think that factors into it too. I wrote Thielen up as one of the risky picks that I'm willing to gamble on. And that was something I mentioned in there as well. So I probably should have mentioned that before, but I think that's a reason not just to invest in Justin Jefferson and Thielen, but KJ Osborne, who's their third receiver. He last year when Thielen was out, he had some really big games. He scored a lot of touchdowns. I think he's a guy that could also benefit as somebody that you're getting in the late rounds. And then if you do end up getting a Thielen injury or a Justin Jefferson, heaven forbid, we don't want to see that happen, but Justin Jefferson get hurt. Man, KJ Osborne could have a great year. Yeah. In the meantime, potentially be a guy that you could throw in your flex or something, even as the wide receiver 3 there. So I think that Vikings passing attack is one that people need to take notice of for sure.
Great. All right, let's go through your overvalueds and we'll get you out here on that. All
right, we'll hit a couple of these quick. I think at quarterback, there's not really that many. I mean, quarterback, people only really move guys up. There's not really that much difference in the rankings. So it's not really a quarterback that I would highlight. At running back, Cam Akers, I'm still worried about this Achilles. I mean, we've just seen so many running backs.
Yeah, they were trying to force it to him in the playoffs, and he had multiple fumbles.
He looked rough coming back, and it was awesome that he came back, and he apparently had this like different type of surgery to allow him to start training and get back that soon, but really didn't help the team that much. And most of these guys that have these Achilles injuries, sometimes they never get back to their regular form, but most of these guys take a couple seasons. And right now we're a year removed from the surgery, right? So, and there's talk that it's going to be more of a split, whether you believe Sean McVay or not, that Darrell Henderson and that Akers are going to split. He referred to them both as, RB1s for him kind of thing. I think there's a chance that Akers isn't the same player, because also Akers wasn't some superstar and he's coming back and we think he could be a superstar again. Right. He was a guy that we just projected to be good. He had a good end to his rookie season, and we thought, man, he could be something if he gets the starting role. And it didn't happen because of the injury. So I'm a little down on him. I think he's getting overvalued. He's a guy that I'm not really excited to take as a top 20 running back. And kind of every time I update my rankings, I bump him down a little bit. J.K. Dobbins, somebody who, he's potentially not going to be ready for week one. Another guy that if he is out there in week one, going to be on a pitch count, I would imagine. The Ravens would be crazy to throw him out there and give him a big workload, because even before the injury, they didn't do that. They liked a committee approach. They had him and Gus Edwards, who also is coming back from the Achilles or from the ACL, right? So I think there's a situation where either Dobbins doesn't start the season, or where Dobbins starts the season and he's not getting as much work. And it's a passing attack where they don't really throw to the running backs that much, even though every season they say they want to. They don't really do it. So that's just another reason to kind of knock Dobbins down. A lot of red flags there. Josh Jacobs, I mean, we could tie it into last night's game. And yes, Josh McDaniels brings over that Patriots approach where let's get all those running backs out there in the preseason. Let's make them compete. And there's some talk that they like the rookie Zamir White quite a bit. I like Zamir White coming out as well. Yeah, I thought he was somebody that, maybe next year when you have Drake and Jacobs gone at that point, because they didn't pick up the 5th-year option for Jacobs, maybe then Zamir White would take over. It could happen sooner. And I am not somebody that's been ragging on Josh Jacobs over the years. He's actually been somebody I've talked up quite a bit, because he continuously puts up, top 10, top 15 fantasy stats at the end of the year, a lot of volume stuff. But I think he's been better for fantasy than people realize. And this year I'm out on him. We talked about Darren Waller, somebody for sure that I think people are overvaluing. I would say Mike Gesicki too, even though I think his ADP is starting to drop now. But when you bring in Tyreek Hill, when you have Jalen Waddle, those guys are going to take so many targets away. Mm-hmm. And Gesicki in the past, his biggest games really came when Devontae Parker was hurt, or when some of those other options weren't there. Gesicki got to step into kind of that number one pass catching role. Now he's really going to take a back seat. And there's been talk that he's going to have to service as more of an actual tight end. Now he's not going to line up out wide as much. He's, going to have to block maybe a little bit more, which is not the best way to use him. But he's a guy that in fantasy had some good games in the past, but I think he's a guy that you should just shy away from completely. There's a lot better options to go after as a late round tight end with more upside.
I got one quick one. You're a Bills fan. I'm not the biggest Devin Singletary guy. Obviously, you mentioned James Cook. How do you think that running back situation plays out?
I really think, based on what we've seen and what we've heard so far, that Singletary is going to keep that starting role. And right from the moment that they drafted Cook, they talked to, the Brandon Beane talked about the fact that Cook was going to come in and play that pass catching role for them. Now, could Cook emerge as sort of Alvin Kamara light, which like skill set wise, he could be that kind of player and he starts to make these explosive plays. And obviously they went after McKissick. They end up getting Cook. They want that pass catching element in the backfield that Singletary really didn't give them much upside in that area. He was just sort of a volume guy catching passes out of the backfield. So it bumped Singletary down for sure in the rankings. Before he was kind of like an underrated guy that could sneak into the low end RB2 range. Now he's more in like that mid to low end RB3 range. Not overly excited about either guy, but the price that you can get them at, kind of like I talked about with Chase Edmonds and Cordell Patterson, you get these guys so late in the draft that there's really no risk involved at all. And if you're going on a zero RB approach or a hero RB approach, and you just need a guy that's going to step in and give you decent stats at that spot, I think both those guys are interesting in half PPR and PPR leagues. Singletary maybe a little bit more now in, standard leagues, which no one's playing anymore in half PPR, but Singletary, now he's getting it from both ends in the way of like Antonio Gibson, like we talked about, where you have Cook taking away some of the passing work. You got Josh Allen there. He'll still be stealing some of the touchdowns away. So it makes it tough for him to pay off without some injuries. But like I said, where you're getting him, there's not really a lot of a risk involved.
Awesome. Justin Boone, lead fantasy analyst for The Score, host of The Score Fantasy Football Podcast. Follow him at Justin Boone, Boone. Appreciate you for joining the Fantasy Football Factory today.
Thanks for having me, guys.